Hello again. We're talking about Gary McEwen. He, as I understand it, was the Silver Commander
Yes.
in relation to this incident.
Yes.
And he was also a Detective Chief Superintendent, same rank as you, as I understand it. Is that correct?
No, he was a divisional commander.
He was
in
a divisional
Fife,
commander.
and he would be a police chief superintendent, not detective chief superintendent.
Right. So we've heard that he was the local police commander for Fife.
Yes.
Is that a more senior position than the one you were in at the time?
We are the same rank, just different roles.
Right. So you were the same rank
Yes.
anyway at that time. You've explained to us before lunch that you were contacted by Gary McEwen and asked to appoint the SIO, and you selected Pat Campbell. You've given us the explanation for that. He didn't have any contact with Fife, which was a factor. And you've explained to us earlier today that you didn't have contact with Fife. Can you help me understand why was Gary McEwen the Silver Commander when he had a connection with Fife instead of you?
So, first of all, Gary didn't ask me to appoint an SIO. He informed me of the circumstances, and then that's my role to determine what investigative resource is required.
Right.
In terms of Silver Command, it is normally the divisional chief superintendent who would take Silver Command. My role actually doesn't fall within the gold, silver, bronze structure. I'm off somewhere to the left or to the right. But that's the normal course. So it'd be a chief officer as gold, the divisional commander as silver, and then the bronze is underneath.
So it was a sort of normal standard appointment for Gary McEwen in his particular role.
Yes.
To take the role of Silver Commander.
Yes, I would not take the role of silver commander.
So even though he had a connection to Fife,
Yes.
and it was an incident involving Fife officers, and you didn't have a connection to Fife, you wouldn't slot into that role?
Absolutely not. Thank
you. Can I ask you about PERC?
Yes.
You've told us that at the 9:30 meeting you'd heard about the death of Mr. Boal. Did you also hear at that time that Gary McEwen had declared a critical incident?
I did.
And you heard that PERC were going to be taking over and leading the investigation?
Yes.
And now, I think in your inquiry statement, you say that you'd no previous experience of dealing with PERC when they were leading an investigation or coming into an investigation. We've heard people say that this was their first investigation into a death after police contact.
Yes.
And I'm interested in, if you can think back to that time, what the impact was on you and in your role of knowing that PERC were taking over the investigation. We've heard evidence that they didn't immediately attend Kirkcaldy Police Office, but people were aware that they were going to be taking the lead.
I around about this time, I don't know if it was just before this, I think it must have been that I had been in liaison with PERC and the Commissioner at the time in terms of her desire to take over investigations involving sexual crime, involving police officers. And there'd been quite a bit of discussion, both with Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, PERC, myself, in terms of whether PERC had the exposure to those sort of investigations before, and how their officers were trained in dealing with rape and sexual crimes, and specifically victims. So there was a lot of work done in terms of getting PERC officers to attend, sexual offences liaison officers, and I think a PERC officer came into the National Rape Task Force, one of my units, and shadowed sexual offences liaison officers. I can only say I think that must have just been before this, because I can't remember having any great surprised that Park were going to come in to take over and lead the investigation.
They'd certainly come into existence at the time.
2013, yeah.
At the time of Police Scotland
Yes.
coming into
So-
existence.
I can't recall being apprehensive or having any emotion in relation to Park coming in. I can only presume that those discussions might have already started with Park about other aspects that they were looking to investigate around that time.
Right, thank you. When you attended the 9:30 meeting, was there any discussion or explanation given at that meeting why it was not possible for Perk to be in Kirkcaldy Police Office by that stage at that time in the day?
No, not at all.
I think in your operational statement at page 2, which we looked at earlier, that's the PS 00669, and we'll get that up on the screen. And if we look at page 2, paragraph 8, and I think this paragraph says, at 11:30 hours same day, I attended a gold meeting which was chaired by ACC Nicholson at Kirkcaldy, where after an initial briefing of the circumstances known at that time, it was confirmed that this would be a Perk-led investigation and Mr. Keith Harrower had been appointed investigating officer. As I understand it, however, you knew about Perk coming in by 9:30.
Yes,
And this was also discussed at 11:30.
yes.
We've heard that Perk weren't at that 11:30 gold meeting.
No,
Was there any explanation given at that meeting why Perk weren't in attendance, either in person or remotely?
no.
No.
Or not that I can remember.
Right. You then go on to say, I was informed that Mr. Harrower, so we're still on the same paragraph, Mr. Harrower and Perk investigators were expected to arrive at Kirkcaldy Police Station imminently for the purposes of briefing and taking over the investigation. And when you say imminently, can you give us a clearer indication of when you understood that they would be arriving?
I suppose in the next, I would only be surmising.
All right.
That's 8 years ago, and
I appreciate
I've said imminently, so probably at the time I thought they were going to be there in the next half an hour or so, but I can't recall.
Thank you. And in terms of your expectations at that time, what had you expected to happen when Perk did arrive, whenever that was?
So my expectations were that there'd be a number of investigators. I didn't have high expectations that they would be able to take on the investigation completely at that time with no or little support from Police Scotland. But I thought there would be a number of Perk investigators. I thought that there would be a suitably quick handover between Pat Campbell and Park, and that I was aware of our legal responsibilities in terms of supporting Park in any way that they so required. And I think I put earlier on in my statement when I spoke to Pat Campbell before leaving Fetties about a number of key posts that we should be thinking about: crime scene manager, house-to-house coordinator, all these other, interview advisor, diversity and equality advisor. So, you know, an SIO is responsible for the investigation and responsible for his and her decisions, but everybody has to understand that they're not expected to be an expert in every type of investigation, and it's that bit where you work as a team, so you bring in your expert crime scene coordinator or crime scene manager to develop the strategy around that, or develop a strategy around CCTV, scoping, or an interview advisor. So my thought process was we should be thinking about these specialists, and if PERC came, it would be good for them to be there in case PERC wanted their support in specialist areas.
Okay. If we look at paragraph 135 of your inquiry statement, please. Is this the list of roles that you were referring to a moment ago when you talked about your statement?
So those would have been, not all of them, but some of them would have been advantageous to Pat Campbell during that initial fast track stage, but thinking that PERC were going to lead the investigation at some point in that day, it would be helpful if they were available, if they were so required by PERC.
Right. Thank you. And that's the role that you were fulfilling, assisting the SIO with obtaining the resources that he needed.
Yes, although it did get difficult when I arrived at Kirkcaldy, but yes, that was part of my role. Or even to give Pat permission if he required to call out people from off duty, or perhaps look at moving resources from other parts of the country.
Right. Tell us how it got difficult when you got to Kirkcaldy.
Just personally for me, not for others. But at that stage of Police Scotland, you could only log on to a computer. The Force intranet from your old legacy division. I had never worked in Fife, so I couldn't log on to any computers. So I had, at that point, a BlackBerry which had email and a phone.
And no access to
No.
the Police Scotland intranet?
No.
And what sort of difficulties did that cause to you in your role?
Well, I suppose the bit about even getting contact details for somebody to try and call them out. I had to go through the force control room for them to look up personal details, telephone numbers, etc. So when I could have just logged on and gone into the force
Did
intranet.
it cause some delays for you carrying out your tasks?
Some. Even just things like if I'd had to refer to a Supt or something, I had no access to anything. So.
Right, thank you. I was asking you a moment ago about what your expectations were when
Yes.
PERC came in. And you said that you'd expected a number of PERC investigators to arrive. Did you have any expectations about the numbers that would arrive from PERC to take over the investigation?
Probably at the time I thought about 6. In hindsight, I've thought about this, and in terms of the specific roles, I would have probably said about 8, with significant support from Police Scotland for that initial first day.
Right. And you then you mentioned a moment ago, a suitably quick handover from Pat Campbell to PERC.
Yeah.
When did you, what were your expectations in terms of when that handover would take place?
So, in serious crime, I mean, it's never great from SIO to hand over to another SIO. Everybody appreciates that, but it happens. And the expectation for serious crime or a serious incident would be there would be a full verbal briefing to the new SIO, outlining actions that had been taken, had not yet been complete, so they're still ongoing, and what was intended actions, so that the new SIO could either review and either agree the actions that were intended to be complete or decide that that wasn't part of their strategy. So it would be quite a comprehensive briefing, but saying that, you know, Pat Campbell had been there for a few hours, 3-4 hours, so it would be manageable.
Mm-hmm.
And then the handover should be recorded and passed on to the other, well, in this case, independent investigator. And I think that's been a problem, it's been a problem, you know, from this inquiry, that Pat Campbell was still referred to as SIO. And I think later on, you know, I was made aware of it or reminded of it when I was given my statement that quite late on at night, Keith Hardy was given the title SIO. And I think that confuses people who's leading the investigation. There can only ever be one SIO.
Mm.
And from that handover period, Pat Campbell relinquishes that title and Perk are now the independent investigators. That's my understanding, how it should have been and how perhaps there was some confusion even later on by people being given titles. There should never have been a police SIO allocated at 8 o'clock at night when the Perk were there.
We've certainly heard evidence from DI Colin Robson, who was an on-duty SIO, and Pat Campbell, he was SIO, and we've heard other, as you say, other officers who at some point have been referred to as SIOs.
Yes. So I would say, from my opinion, that Colin Robson was the duty detective inspector.
Right.
He informed his detective superintendent of an emerging traumatic incident. Pat Campbell was appointed SIO.
And is there only ever one SIO?
There is only ever one SIO.
You can't have multiple people in
No,
that role?
absolutely not. Because, you know, in terms of accountability, one person makes the decision and one person is then responsible for the decision.
So from what you're saying, am I to understand that Pat Campbell was the appointed SIO?
Yes.
And he remained in that role and was accountable for it until the official handover to Perk.
Yes.
And then from that point of handover, there would be someone in Perk appointed as SIO, or the equivalent of an SIO.
Yes. And my understanding was that on the arrival of Keith Harrower, that handover would take place and he is now leading that investigation.
And in terms of leading an investigation, are there benefits in being physically present in the police office in order to take over an investigation? Is it necessary to be present?
Yes.
And
In my opinion.
Yeah,
I'm sure others might, but part of an SIO's duties is not only in terms of responsibility of the conduct of the investigation, they're also responsible for the resources. That would be very difficult to do if you're remote.
Right. You've said at paragraph 103 of your inquiry statement I'm interested in the final sentence in paragraph 103. The first time I saw Perk was when they arrived later on in the afternoon. You say that's the first time you saw them. Had you had a contact with Perk
No.
prior to that?
No.
Were you aware that there had been telephone contact
Yes.
with Pat Campbell?
Yes.
And so in terms of a direct communication between the investigation side of things and Perk, was that done through Pat Campbell?
Yes.
Do you remember when they arrived later that day?
So there was, I think it was called a perk briefing. I think, if not immediately on their arrival, shortly after their arrival, on the Sunday.
We've heard that the first Gold Group meeting was at 11:30 and they
Yes.
weren't present at that. But PERC were present at the second Gold Group meeting, which was at 2:40.
Yes.
Was the PERC briefing prior to that second Gold Group meeting? Sorry, was the PERC briefing prior to?
No, maybe that was the 14:30 meeting. I can't recall. Actually, will it be my initial statement?
If you look at the original statement, page 2,
No, that's, sorry.
paragraph, you've got a paragraph in relation to 1330, which is the final paragraph on page 2.
13:30.
You
yes.
say 1330, Harrower and other PERC investigators attended. And there was a briefing. Were you at the PERC briefing?
Yes.
And you say a briefing which provided the same information as provided at the Gold meeting was provided. Was that the first Gold Group meeting?
Yes.
And that was shared with PERC when they arrived?
Yes.
And then the second Gold Group meeting was at, we've heard, 1440?
Yes.
Thank you. Thinking about that now, the events involving Mr. Bayo at Hayfield Road had taken place at between about 7:20 and 7:30 in the morning. And there's been contact with PERC and Pat Campbell, the SIO, during that day. They arrived at 13:30. Did you have any concerns about the period, the period that had taken place between the events actually at Hayfield Road and the arrival of PERC in the afternoon?
I thought there was a time delay. I thought it was maybe not significant. I would have expected them to arrive sometime sooner than they did, given the circumstances and their appointment by Crown Office at 9 o'clock or around about then.
We've heard that after Mr. Bayo died
Yes.
and critical incident was declared by Gary McEwen at 9:10, within minutes of him being told about the death, that then there was, we've not heard from the Crown yet, but we've heard that shortly after that there was a decision taken by the Crown that PERC should be involved.
Yes.
And you say there was a time delay. Did you have concerns about that at the time? About this period that had elapsed before they arrived?
Yeah, I suppose my concerns were the reason and rationale for PERC being appointed independent investigators was absolutely crucial. And their speedy response to that, for me, was important for that independence, both in terms of Pat Campbell's role and, importantly, that message to the public that the Crown had asked for independent investigators and that they were now leading the investigation.
Talking about the independence of PERC, we heard evidence from Pat Campbell some time ago, day 49 of the inquiry, that at that stage he had 20 or 22 detectives involved with the investigation, and that on day 1. And he expressed some concerns about the fact that PERC brought along 4 or 5 investigators. I'm interested in the comparison between the two. I mean, you've talked about maybe they'd bring 6 people from PERC, but there seems to be there's a difference between the Police Scotland detectives who were involved, 2022, and the number of investigators coming from PERC.
Yes.
Did you have concerns about that?
When I realised the number of members of PERC staff who arrived, I did have concerns about it.
Can you explain about those concerns?
That in terms of key roles, I thought PERC would immediately assume there wasn't any. And I've worked with other agencies in joint investigations. Health and Safety Executive is one.
I'm going to ask you about that, actually.
All right, okay. Where there's an acknowledgement that there is little resource, or, the resources aren't significant. They're fantastic investigators, I'd have to say. But, there's not that pool of staff. I didn't expect PERC to come with 20 investigators. What I did probably expect there would be enough to be able to take on key roles and to be there to monitor other fast-tracked actions that were required that first day that they were requesting Police Scotland to undertake. So I expected, in terms of a family liaison officer, I expected crime scene managers or a number of investigators, which, may have to be, they would take the statement, they may be supported in terms of corroboration by a Police Scotland officer, if that was appropriate, but as long as they were there to monitor or supervise the activities, for example, the forensic recovery of Mr. Boal's body, they could have sent one PERC officer, and Police Scotland could have undertaken that duty on their instruction, but there was somebody there to supervise it from PERC to say, we are certain that it was done to the requirements of PERC.
Thank you. So exploring that in a little more detail, how many FLOs would you have, in terms of expectation from PERC, would you have expected to arrive?
Probably on that first day, 2.
And would that be in relation to the next of kin?
Yes, until we'd established family dynamics.
Right. And then we've heard evidence that there were 5 loci identified.
Mm-hmm.
That included Victoria Hospital, where Mr. Boal's body was, and Hayfield Road.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3 other addresses were identified as being of interest. Colette Bell's address, Martin Dick, a friend's address, and the family home of Mr. Said. When you said crime scene managers
Mm-hmm.
would be brought by, you expected to be available from PERC, would that have been one for each of those locations or less than that?
Or maybe a crime scene coordinator may have been the more appropriate term to use then. Somebody who could coordinate between the different crime scenes if there was a Police Scotland crime scene manager in each of the locations.
Right. So it could have been one person or it could have been more than one?
Yeah.
And then, did you have any expectations in relation to the numbers of investigators that PERC would bring?
I didn't expect that many, but I expected maybe 4.
Thank you. As said, we've heard evidence from Pat Campbell that he had about 20 or 22 detectives involved with the investigation. Do you have any concerns about the numbers he had acting on that day?
I can't recall Pat asking for more resources.
Mhm.
I'd probably say that's quite a lot of officers. I know there was a bit to do. Sometimes there's a bit about if you have too many officers involved, you sometimes can lose control of what's happening to a certain extent. So there's a bit about things have to be done quickly, but there's also a bit about, as the SIO, of knowing that bigger picture. But it depends on the 22 that we're talking about. Some might have been involved in specific duties that, you know, for example, taking a witness statement or something like that. So, you know, that takes 2 out the equation. So 22 seems to me quite a significant number. And I think in terms of the support for Pat Campbell, which is probably unique in this case, there was more senior officers. So there was Stuart Houston as DCI, Keith Hardy came out as DI, there was a DI, Colin Robson, and another DI was called out later on. So to have a detective superintendent, a detective chief inspector, and 2, potentially 3 detective inspectors, that was quite some support for Pat.
Right, thank you. Can I ask you, at that time on that day, did you have a clear understanding of what PERC's remit was going to be? Now, we've heard people say about they knew that PERC's remit expanded over time, but did you have a clear understanding of what PERC were coming in to lead on in terms of the investigation?
My expectation was they were leading on all aspects of the death of Mr. Boal.
And when you say all aspects, can you explain what you understood? What would all aspects cover?
All the circumstances surrounding his death.
So you didn't understand there were to be any limitations on the remit of PERC at that time?
No.
Thank you.
And I know that there was, obviously, I was informed earlier on in terms of the eyewitnesses to the restraint that PERC were going to obtain those statements. So there was clear focus for PERC on eyewitnesses to the restraint. But in terms of that overall investigative responsibility, that would be handed over to PERC.
Thank you. We were talking about independence a moment ago, the independence of PERC. Did you have any concerns on that day about the independence of PERC? You've mentioned appointing Pat Campbell because he didn't have any connection with Fife. Did you have any concerns in relation to PERC about that?
No. Well, I suppose my view was Crown Office Procurator Fiscals, their responsibility in terms of the investigation of death in Scotland, they had appointed PERC. I don't think I would have considered any concerns for PERC's independence. I don't know if you mean independence in terms of any footprint they had on Fife particularly.
Yes, as former members of Police Scotland or legacy forces within Police Scotland.
To be honest, I didn't know anybody from PERC. I know there must have been some, I think Keith Harrower had been a retired police officer because he seemed to know Rory Nicholson, the ACC, and there was a bit of, chat at the beginning when they first arrived. But apart from the other PERC investigators, I don't know who they were.
Looking back now, concerns have been expressed in certain quarters about former police officers joining PERC and then investigating incidents involving police officers. Do you have any concerns about that?
To be honest, I think it depends on public opinion. I mean, if I was asked, I don't think I would have any hesitation in terms of, being a previous police officer and investigating police conduct. But that's not, I'm an ex-police officer, and for me that's just because I think that certain people could do that objectively, impartially, but it's not for an individual. I think that's a public decision to be made, whether it is appropriate or not. So,
Right.
sorry if
No,
that's a
not at
ramble.
all. Thank you. We've heard evidence from Pat Campbell that he had a number of reservations about PERC and giving a handover to PERC. Can I tell you what he said and ask you
Yes.
for your comments? This was on day 47, the 9th of March. He said he was reluctant, or he had a reluctance to relinquish control to PERC. It was moving at a pace in the right direction, but he had trepidation that it would set back the investigation. What could they actually do with the numbers they had when we had so many different priorities? Can you comment on that or his concerns? Do you agree with that?
So first of all, that's not Pat's decision. The Crown Office has appointed PERC. And whether Pat Campbell thinks he can do a better job than PERC, then unfortunately that's not his decision. That's
Right.
The decision has been made by Crown Office Procurement Fiscal Service. In terms of what he thought was happening and continued to happen, Pat Campbell could have been there and would have been there in terms of supporting the independent investigating officer from PERC once they'd taken over the investigation. So it wasn't as if Pat Campbell would just be passing over and then walking out the door. And yes, I agree about the number of resources and that the pace of the investigation. In terms of the pace of the investigation, it was fast-track actions that they were completing on those 24, 48 hours. And whatever resource PERC arrived with, there was still going to be a need for Police Scotland support, and it was, I think, Pat's responsibility to assist PERC, not to keep hold of what was happening. So I can see his frustrations. I agree with his frustrations, but in terms of not wanting to hand over, that's not his decision, or shouldn't have been his decision.
Did Pat Campbell have any discussions with you about these concerns which he had?
No.
No.
I think, to be honest, I think we're all a bit disappointed in the time it taken and the level of resource. But Pat never expressed to me that he wasn't wanting to hand over the investigation because it was moving at pace and he felt that he could possibly do a better job than the PERC investigators.
Okay. Can I ask you to look at your inquiry statement again, please? Paragraphs 132 and 133.
Yes.
132, I think Kirkcaldy officers may have undertaken some tasks before other officers arrived. I would have wanted no staff from Kirkcaldy involved in the investigation. That would have been my ideal. In a way, it puts those Kirkcaldy officers in quite a difficult position as well. Can you explain that paragraph?
So, yes, it is just the bit about impartiality and objectiveness, their own personal feelings, and being removed from the individuals. I think what I was trying to do was, as far as possible, make sure that the officers or the support that Pat had in terms of a detective resource, as far as possible, were not from Fife and not from Kirkcaldy. That would have been the ideal for me, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
So it wasn't 100% possible on that day?
No, no.
And you say Kirkcaldy officers may have undertaken some tasks before other officers arrived. Do you remember any of the tasks that were being carried out by Kirkcaldy officers?
Well, I think his name escapes me, the detective inspector, the first SIO.
Colin Robson?
Colin Robson. He had undertaken and caused for a number of tasks to be undertaken. I can't remember specifically which you would have expected at that, initial action, the golden hour as they probably call it. There would have been no opportunity for others to undertake those tasks.
And we've heard from a DS Dursley that other officers were brought in from the wider Fife area,
Yes.
out with Kirkcaldy to assist with matters. And from hearing Gary McEwen's evidence yesterday, I understand P Division was Fife effectively.
Yes.
Would you, if you'd been running this ideally, been able to avoid any officers from Fife being involved, or was it only officers from Kirkcaldy that you were concerned about?
Ideally, it would be no officers from Fife, but that's in an ideal world, and it's a Sunday morning, and resources across the country unfortunately limited. And I think, you could probably look at duty sheets to say that there was so many officers, detectives on duty, but some of them will be involved in an arrest, some will be interviewing suspects, some will have had interviewing witnesses for their own, that business continuity. So in an ideal world, it would have been perfect, but as far as possible, I think this is what we got.
Would you draw a distinction between officers from Fife or from Kirkcaldy being involved in the investigation or being involved only with things like locus protection? Do you see that as separate from the investigation?
I suppose I'd probably, no, it would be the investigation. So there would have been some Fife officers involved in those initial fast-track actions.
A short time ago you talked about other organisations, and I would like to ask you about the Health and Safety Executive.
Mm-hmm.
We've not heard any evidence yet from the HSE. Hopefully next year that position will change. But I did ask Gary McEwen about this yesterday, and you've mentioned the HSE today. What had your involvement been with the HSE?
So I've had a couple of involvements with Health and Safety Executive, but probably the main one was following the tragic death of a Lothian and Borders fire officer in 2009 in Gorgie in Edinburgh. So there was a joint investigation into the death and the circumstances surrounding it. And there was, obviously, at that time it was Lothian and Borders police officers and Health and Safety Executive. We'd arranged a couple of outside specialists from Legacy Strathclyde Fire and Rescue Service who came as well to give that sort of expert fire advice. But that investigation continued for, probably 6 months. It was a long investigation. And I would have to say the health and safety executive investigators, there was only 3 of them, but they were very good.
And that sounds like that was a positive experience working with the HSE.
Yes, it was.
And
But resources are limited in HSE. You know, so I think there's a bit about organisations, the expectation that they would be able to, or they've got lots of staff to come in and parachute in and solve all the problems, but they struggle for, well, I can't speak on their behalf, but my experience was that they sometimes struggle for resources as well.
I'm interested in, against the background of questions regarding independence and hopefully trying to avoid Kirkcaldy or possibly Fife officers investigating this incident. Issues with resources. And whether there were any discussions at the Gold Group meetings or discussions with PERC about perhaps involving HSE to provide support in relation to this investigation?
No, there wasn't.
Is that the sort of thing that could be raised at a Gold Group meeting?
I think that's probably, well, it could have been raised at the Gold meeting. I think that's probably a discussion initially between, PERC and Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, for them to say, actually, we're struggling to provide the resource required for this, and for Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service to initiate that. It could have been for, I don't think it would be for Pat Campbell, for example, to make contact with Health and Safety Executive to say, PERC have arrived and there's not enough people. What about supporting?
Were there any routes or any mechanism whereby if an officer did have concerns, an officer such as an SIO had concerns, that he could, either through contact with the Crown or PERC Direct, raise questions about involving another body in a joint investigation?
Of course, they're, in terms of my experience with Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, that would be, there wouldn't have to be formality in that, just, contact. I just think nobody thought about, from a police perspective, I never thought about HSC. No thought about them at all. So maybe it was something that we were unaware that HSC could be asked to support PERC.
Well, it may be that we'll hear more from PERC in the future. Thank you. Can I ask you about paragraphs 115 to 118 of your inquiry statement, please? You say, I've been asked against that background I provided, what did I consider was the nature of the inquiry at that time? Just for complete, let's look at the previous paragraph. So this is where you're actually being asked to talk about the nature of the investigation and the events at Hayfield Road. So if we look at paragraph 115, and you're being asked, what did I consider was the nature of the inquiry? I considered the nature of the investigation to be a death in police custody investigation. The investigation should include the whole circumstances, but the bottom line was the person had been in police custody at the time of his death in a hospital setting. The police involvement may have had a significant role in the cause of death. It was a death in police custody, but was being investigated at that time with the cause of death being unascertained.
Yes.
And is that because there'd been no post-mortem on the 3rd of May, or are you talking longer term than just the first day?
No, I was only involved in the first day, so the cause of death was unascertained on that first day.
Right, thank you. And you're saying it's the whole circumstances, but the bottom line was the person had been in police custody at the time of his death, and the police involvement may have had a significant role in the cause of death. So was that an understanding by you on the first day that one of the possibilities was that the police involvement may have had a significant role in his death?
Yes.
And then at 116, you talk about potentially there may be criminality on the part of the police officers. However, like other unascertained deaths, there would be a number of hypotheses and each one would be investigated. So one of the possibilities is that there was some criminality on the part of the police officers.
Yes.
And at 117, you talk about investigative hypotheses. As SIO, you have to consider what these hypotheses are and rule them in or out. Criminality of the police officers is a hypothesis. It's for the SIO to decide other hypotheses and what should be done to investigate them. A number might be investigated together. So you obviously have experience as SIO. Is this the sort of thing that you would note in your day book, hypotheses that you were working on or developing?
So I want to counter this by saying that each SIO runs investigations differently, and there is no, one is not right and one is not wrong. It's just an individual thing. I would, but it's just me. I record everything in my day book, and we'd have the list of hypotheses I was thinking about in my day book when I was thinking about what would have to be done before raising actions, etc. I suppose the other bit, which is probably not quite clear, I have mentioned of it, been investigated this time as a cause of death being unascertained. I think it's quite important, and I'm sure I'm just repeating what other people have said, the 3 stages of an investigation.
No, I've not heard this. What are the 3 stages?
So there's normally 3 stages in an investigation. So the first stage is your initial response, which is sometimes called this golden hour, which is usually a bit longer than an hour, but in any case. And so it's golden hour and fast track actions. So that's the first stage of your investigation. And normally your fast track actions will take 24, 48 hours. And then it goes on to the investigation strategy. So that's really when you're starting to think about your objectives of the investigation and all your different hypotheses in terms of if there's information that's missing to try and fill that gap and make more sense of what you've got in the fast track actions. And then the last part of it is your, reporting, case management, disclosure or revelation to the Procurator Fiscal. It's at the completion of the investigation and next steps. So it could be a report to Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service. So those are the 3 stages normally in an investigation. But at the first day, what you've also got to understand or has to take place is you've got to report a death to the Procurator Fiscal for the Procurator Fiscal the next day, and then a copy is provided to the pathologist. So you've got your initial actions, but you're also looking at the death, and my training and having, worked with some fantastic pathologists, is your death report should be as full and comprehensive as possible, so that it may provide some context during the post-mortem examination. So there's the initial actions and the death report that has to be completed within those, 24 hours for the death report, 48 hours for the fast actions. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is probably some of these hypotheses that I mentioned were for initial fast track actions and to complete the death report as full as possible. Does that make sense?
No, that's very helpful. We heard from Pat Campbell that as he was travelling to Kirkcaldy, that he was thinking about his own hypotheses. He was driving at the time, so but was already starting to formulate possible hypotheses in his head. So, and from what you said about the report that would be sent to the fiscal, it wouldn't. Am I right in thinking that wouldn't be unusual? It's not like you'd have to wait till later to start doing that in terms of these 3 stages.
So Pat Campbell was only involved in stage 1. The investigative strategy would follow and would naturally follow to PERC. But if we're saying, I suppose I'm not really explaining myself very clearly, in terms of, the potential that Mr. Bayo's ethnicity had caused officers to respond in a different way on initially having contact with Mr. Bayo and then restraining him. So in terms of that situation, the initial fast track and trying to find out what the motive, if there was a motive for those officers, in terms of if they had stereotypical views or if they were discriminatory or did they want to carry out a malicious act against Mr. Bayo. So in terms of the fast track actions, the hypotheses that the officers had acted criminally towards Mr. or could have acted criminally towards Mr. Bayo, the fast track actions, the majority of them would not take that into account. So in terms of the forensic recovery of Mr. Bayo's body, would have not provided any information or in terms of how the officers had acted at the scene. Does that make sense? No.
No, it's very helpful. So at that stage, can I summarise this as the actions you're taking initially, none of them will of themselves permit you to exclude a hypothesis as a possibility?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Is that fair to say? If I'm wrong in what I've just said, please say. But you're not at an early stage, you can't be simply excluding hypotheses.
Absolutely not. And at the very early stage, you are carrying out tasks that are trying to provide information for later on during the investigative strategy, what support to any hypotheses are. But those initial fast track actions are about securing, managing, obtaining the information that allows then the investigative strategy to develop better.
Excellent. Thank you very much. No, that's clear. I understand that. So let's say...
I wonder if this might be a point to take
I didn't
a break.
appreciate the time.
15-minute break at this point.
Thank you. I didn't realise it was...
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We were looking at your inquiry statement, and if we could have that back on the screen, please. And I think we had talked about paragraph 116. Potentially there may be criminality on the part of the police officers. However, like other unascertained deaths, there would be a number of hypotheses and each one would be investigated. So I was about to move on to the investigative hypotheses. So I'd like to go through some of these paragraphs with you, if that's all right with you. Let's look at paragraph 117. As SIO, you have to consider what these hypotheses are and rule them in or out. Criminality of the police officers is a hypothesis. It's for the SIO to decide other hypotheses and what should be done to investigate them. A number might be investigated together. So there could be a number of different possibilities considered as hypotheses in relation to any unascertained death.
Yes.
And we heard from Pat Campbell that he formed and developed a number of hypotheses separate. And then at 118, you say, I think it's good to list what they are. You've told us that you would have had these things noted in a daybook if it had been your investigation. And the paragraph goes on to say, I think the hypotheses approach is mentioned in training. In terms of the murder manual, which is a guide for how to investigate homicides, there is a section on hypotheses in that document. For me, and I can't say this for everybody, it allows me to think about every possibility to make sure you're either eliminating a possibility or finding the evidence and following that evidence to see how far it takes you. So if you're developing different hypotheses, will you develop strategies to investigate each of those hypotheses?
Not necessarily. So in terms of a hypothesis, and I suppose this relates to both the investigation and, as I said, the death report. So one hypothesis might have been there was an underlying medical condition that maybe caused or contributed to Mr. Boal's death. So you wouldn't need a strategy for that. That would be, hopefully you get details of the GP from the next of kin. But in any case, the pathologist would want GP's notes before the post-mortem examination. So you would need a strategy around that.
So you may have a strategy depending on the hypothesis,
Yes.
or you may not. You may have a clear way of progressing.
Yes. I suppose it's a bit where, in many investigations, so the SIO is trying to answer questions. And on many investigations, the answers will be readily available. And in other investigations, it might not be available, and there's probably that hypothesis to try and work out a way how to gather that evidence or information to exclude or have the hypotheses remaining. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. So you're talking here about you're either eliminating a possibility or finding evidence, presumably supportive evidence, following that supportive evidence, gathering that in, and see how far that takes you.
Yes, and I think that's referring to what Pat Campbell's talking about in terms of following the evidence.
So there may be some hypotheses that are very quickly resolved
Yes.
and quickly excluded, perhaps.
Yes, and another, I don't know whether, I don't think it was a hypothesis. It was a request from the ECC to get counter-terrorist checks done.
Yes.
So that is quickly eliminated in terms of was this a possibility to be, counter-terrorism a factor in this.
So presumably, I think we heard from Pat Campbell that in terms of the Gold Group, they were to be checking intelligence
Yes.
with the National Bureau and seeing if there was anything at all.
Absolutely. So it's a quick elimination, I would say.
Right.
Quickly eliminated.
But other hypotheses may require a strategy and may require further investigation.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then paragraph 119. In terms of Mr. Boal, we learned later on there was a disturbance at an address he'd been at. The question was whether Mr. Boal was involved, who else was involved, and what type of disturbance took place, and was anyone assaulted during the disturbance. One hypothesis for me would have been, was Mr. Boal assaulted prior to coming into contact with police? And if so, was the assault relevant to any injuries he received or relevant to the cause of death? And tell us a little bit about how you would investigate that as a hypothesis.
So I suppose it's the bit about, I think there was...
We've heard evidence, and the chair has witness statements available, to suggest that there had been a physical altercation
assault. Yes.
in Arran
Yes, that's
Crescent prior to Mr. Boal ending up in Hayfield Road.
Yes. So I suppose the hypothesis is that had Mr. Boal been injured during that interaction, and if he was injured, were any of those injuries, did they cause or contribute to the cause of death? And if the case that they weren't, then that line of investigation could be complete.
What sort of things would an SIO or police officers do to investigate that as a hypothesis?
So there could be witness statements from the other person involved. There might be forensic evidence available. There could be CCTV evidence to, if it was in a dwelling, it's unlikely, but if it hadn't been within a dwelling, CCTV evidence to show the extent of the interaction between the two individuals involved.
Could perhaps a post-mortem be part of the evidence that's gathered in on that?
So I think this is the hypothesis, to allow that information to be provided to the pathologist in the death report, so that the pathologist would have that information and may be able to take that into account during the post-mortem and any injuries. So if the individual had said, and this is just hypothetical.
Hypothetically, yes.
You know, I punched I punched the deceased once to the temple, and there was a bruise on the temple which had no indication or no contributing factors in the death. We can rule out that that incident had any relation to. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, for these parts, I was talking more about providing information as well to the pathologist and the procurator fiscal to see if that would assist them during post-mortem examination.
So the hypothesis is formulated, perhaps
Yes.
that the subject, the deceased, was assaulted prior to arriving at the scene. A strategy is then developed and eyewitness statements will be obtained and evidence gathered. And then that will be explained to the pathologist in the report. And then the pathologist can consider the likelihood of that assault having taken place as part of the post-mortem.
Yes.
And as you say, if there is eyewitness evidence, a statement saying a blow to the temple, and that has no bearing, the pathologist rules that out, does that then allow that hypothesis to be brought to a close, brought to
Yes.
an end?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's look at paragraph 120. And this is the one that you've already mentioned. Another hypothesis would be, was his death due to an underlying medical condition? Information would be obtained from his GP and or specialist and statement from family members. If I was SIO, I would normally list my hypotheses or anything that may be relevant in terms of a potential cause of death. I would note down the hypotheses and then allocate out priority actions, the most likely hypotheses initially. Where there is no evidence to support a hypothesis, it can be eliminated. That's not to say every SIO is the same. Some will and some won't. Also, hypotheses ensure you don't exclude anything. Some things could be overlooked otherwise. So you mentioned the possibility of an underlying medical condition.
Yes, I probably said caused, but I suppose it could be caused or contributed to the death.
All right, sorry, which line are you talking about? Is that line 4?
Yes, in terms of a
Right.
potential cause of death, that should be a potentially causing or contributing to the death.
All right, thank you. And I think earlier you said that wouldn't need a particular strategy. It's quite easily ruled out if there is no underlying medical condition. Is this something that would also be given, information that would also be given to the pathologist? If you had a confirmation perhaps and a statement from a family member there was no underlying medical problems?
So I think I'd mentioned that normally you would obtain
GP
you'd be asking the family initially in that initial stage, was there in terms of his health, did he have an underlying health condition, and even apart from that, how was he feeling on the day? So the GP might not have known, but he he or she maybe have been complaining to their family about feeling unwell or had chest pains or something like that. So it's trying to get that information to allow the pathologist to consider. It might be irrelevant, but at least my experience is you try and prepare as a comprehensive death report as possible, which may assist during post-mortem examination.
Well, we heard from the pathologist in relation to Mr. Bio's death that she looked for things like a chest infection or an infection in other areas of the body.
Absolutely.
And so the evidence that you've gathered in about something like an infection, an underlying health condition, could be of assistance to the pathologist.
So I suppose a known condition, and if somebody's been unwell, that has not been to the GP about it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And you say where there's no evidence to support a hypothesis, it could be eliminated. In terms of something like an underlying health condition, although you've maybe recovered the GP records, you maybe have statements from the family, would you wait to rule out that as a possibility until you've heard from the pathologist? Or would you feel comfortable as an SIO ruling it out if the family say there was nothing wrong with him?
No, I would put on the death report that there's nothing from the family suggest that the individual had been feeling unwell, in the preceding days or weeks. However, probably the post-mortem examination would determine if there was any further investigation. If the post-mortem's suggesting that there was nothing untoward found in relation to the deceased being a healthy person, then you would keep that in abeyance until the final post-mortem is provided.
The final post-mortem would be of some significance because presumably there could be underlying health conditions that were not known to the GP or not known to the family.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Paragraph 121. Chief Superintendent McEwen and I didn't discuss the nature of the investigation. Race as a possibility was not discussed with Chief Superintendent McEwen. However, it is in the back of your mind when you're thinking about all possibilities. In terms of hypotheses, one would have been that the male had been treated differently because he was a black male. You've already mentioned this today. I can't remember having a conversation with anybody else about it, but the feeling I got was that everybody was thinking along the same lines as me, that it was a possibility that the actions of the police officers or a police officer was because Mr. Bio was black. I think you've already mentioned this as hypotheses. Can you explain a little more about what you mean by this hypotheses?
I think I'd mentioned it earlier. The possibility that Mr. Bayou's ethnicity had impacted or caused officers to react differently at their initial attendance. So when they first had contact with Mr. Bayou, and thereafter during the restraint of Mr. Bayou. Now, whether that's stereotyping, discrimination, or whether they wanted to undertake a sort of malicious act, intent, or recklessness in terms of his care. So that was, that is a hypothesis.
And in terms of your own personal experience in the work you've done, is that what gave rise to you thinking about this hypothesis, or was it something else? You've talked about the murder manual, you've talked about awareness generally of what's going on.
No, I think the circumstances on that day were clear to everybody that this was a black male who had been restrained and had become unresponsive during restraint. And what's happened, this is not a unique case. This has happened before elsewhere in the UK. So, of course, that is a hypothesis.
Thank you. And you've then, moving on to paragraph 122, you said, I've been asked how we would investigate this hypothesis.
Yes.
On day one, the focus was more on managing and securing those vital bits of physical or other evidence. The longer investigation strategy would have developed the following days and weeks. We were dealing with the critical incident at the time. I'm not saying it wasn't on Pat Campbell's radar in those first few hours. He would have to answer that himself. We've heard evidence from Pat Campbell. Or the Perks radar, we've not yet heard from them. But at that early stage, the focus was on making sure the loci were secured and evidence was recovered. These are the main actions that you have to consider. Certainly we've heard evidence from Gary McEwen over the past couple of days, and he's spoken about a race hypothesis, if I can call it that. Looking at that paragraph, if we can perhaps move down the page, is perhaps clear to you. Are you suggesting that this is one of the hypotheses, but it's not something that can be ruled out on day one? Is that a fair summary of what's said here?
Absolutely not. I suppose I've probably not explained myself very well, but in terms of the three strands of an inquiry, first strand being initial actions and initial priorities, fast track actions. It's really the second. So I think when I've said that's the back of your mind, that's probably not the best terminology, but you know what could have happened here. But those fast track actions are there, which will allow those hypotheses to develop further. And the whole bit about whether Mr. Bayou's race was a feature in terms of how the officers acted, that's always there. But the fast track actions are not going to, they may secure and protect and obtain information as to the motivation of officers, but it's highly unlikely that any of those fast track actions on day one will provide you any intelligence or information or evidence about motivation.
That's very clear. And in the absence of that, you can't exclude this as a possibility.
Oh, no. You're not. You're not even at the stage when you're getting to the stage of broadening out your investigative strategy around that possible hypothesis in the first 24, 48 hours.
Thank you. Can I ask you to help us understand, if you're developing this hypothesis and as an SIO you want to investigate that hypothesis, what are the types of evidence that you might want to seek out that will allow you to develop your ideas on that hypothesis? Can you give me some examples of the types of evidence that you'd want to see before you start analysing that hypothesis, if I can put it that way?
So it's quite difficult to investigate motive to a certain extent. So the types of things, and I suppose the first 24 hours that you would hope to obtain, so those significant eyewitnesses to the restraint would be really important.
Would that be...
And probably, when I say really important, those 24 or 48 hours, at least their initial statement, and I think there's a bit about initial statement and then the full comprehensive statement, because if it was really wanting to try and delve down into the officer's actions, you would hope that you could get initial statement and then have an interview advisor sit down and come up with an interview plan for those witnesses to make sure that everything's covered that would either support or not support your hypotheses. Initial statement from the officers themselves, which I'm sure you'll come on to later on, to get their initial statement there would be good, so that an interview advisor would definitely want to sit down and draw up a plan in terms of a comprehensive interview of the officers concerned. I'm trying to think. CCTV, obviously, without any shadow of a doubt. Safeguarding the airways traffic during that incident. So not only to listen to it, but there might be suggestions of chatter in the background that you might have to go and get a specialist, an audio forensic specialist, to take away, to listen to the background noise to make sure there wasn't any derogatory comments or whatever. But none of these would happen in your first 24 hours anyway. It would be in the few days afterwards, once you developed your strategy. How are you going to investigate motivation of those officers? So you'll be investigating what they did and the dynamics of the restraint to see whether it came within training and reasonable force and all the other issues. But if you're specifically looking at Mr. Boal's ethnicity as being a factor in this, then those 24, 48 hours, I don't think, would provide. It might be very clear from an eyewitness account, but it's a longer term, more complex strategy to draw out.
You've given me a lot there. Can I just know that I've taken notes? You've talked about initial statements and then a full statement. And we heard some evidence a while ago from Conrad Trickett. He was appointed post-incident manager. And he gave some helpful evidence about the sort of initial statements that are envisaged in that procedure, and then a more detailed statement being taken later once the officers had perhaps recovered some of their composure. I think, if I can put it that way. Is that the type of scenario you're talking about here when you talk about initial statements and then a full statement?
I think it's appropriate in certain circumstances. I think there's two parts to this. There's a bit of, if somebody's gone through a traumatic event, it's not best practice to take a full comprehensive statement from them at the time. And what you want to do is absolutely drill in on the key important points and get an initial statement, or I think sometimes it's called an initial account, but I would say initial statement of those facts. So you know what they're saying, but then the importance of then coming up with a full interview plan drawn up by an interview advisor so that you can drill into each of those points. And so that there's probably two benefits. There's one benefit in terms of it's not good to take a full comprehensive statement of somebody who's got trauma. And the other benefit for the investigation is you can plan it really well. And we do that we do this routinely in other areas. So I can give you an example if you want.
Please do, yes.
So it sounds like I only talk about rape and sexual crime, but in rape investigations, the initial officer will take what we call, or what Police Scotland, I keep saying we, I'm not, what Police Scotland calls an initial briefing document. So that is very succinct in terms of the immediate information you have to know, and enough detail then for a sexual offences liaison officer to receive that, draw up an interview plan, and then interview the victim. It's the same with child abuse investigation units. It's the same process. So, and the vast majority of homicides will be the same. An initial statement will be taken if they are what you would call a significant witness, which the officers are, and the eyewitnesses to the restraint would be, then the use of an interview advisor is crucial.
Is an interview advisor a specially trained
Yes.
police officer?
Yes, and I think that was one of the things listed that I asked Pat Campbell to think about, not because there was going to be any comprehensive interviews taking place that day, but it's a bit about once you start getting the initial statements, as soon as you get the initial statements, the interview advisor has sight of everybody's statement, so they know then how to draw up an interview plan for an individual.
And you have talked about different elements of evidence. Can I just ask you some other things? You've talked about CCTV.
Mm-hmm.
Would that include things like mobile phone footage, as well as fixed cameras, CCTV?
So if that was obviously available on the day, then that should have been seized. So you've got it.
Yeah.
Probably part of the next, or part of your building strategy would be then to deploy a CCTV coordinator to go round and then, for example, if it was a whole range of houses in Hayfield Road, identify the areas or locations that would have best view of where the restraint scene was. They would be prioritised to basically see if there was obvious CCTV, and if not, go into businesses, tap on people's doors to ask them if they had CCTV available.
And you've mentioned the airwaves. We've heard evidence that they're between officers on their police radios.
Yes.
Conversations that are taking place between members of Police Scotland.
Yes, so it's conversations between the officers and the control room, and that will be recorded, that will be retained, so that you would ensure in those fast track actions that that is available for listening to, and then maybe part of your investigative strategy, as I said, might be to get some specialist individual to come and listen to what's behind the sort of obvious speech.
And how quickly are things like airwaves available to investigators? We're talking about the sort of first day. Are they available on that day?
Yeah, yes. I know definitely phone calls into the police are available immediately, because I've been either superintendent or whatever. You will get a audio message, so they're instantaneous. You know, they send them in an audio file to you for an SIO to review calls, etc.
Right.
In terms of airwaves, it's all recorded, so it's not, you know, it's not difficult to obtain.
And would call cards be of interest to an investigator investigating a hypothesis of this sort?
Call cards. So, yeah, well, it depends. If we're specifically dealing with the restraint aspect and the officer's actions and their motivations, which I think that's what we're focusing on, absolutely, that would be identifying individuals who witnessed the incident, which I think I mentioned before, PERC were going to specifically speak to those members of the public.
And
I'm always, can I just say, I'm a wee bit sceptical of what you're calling call cards. I would call a storm incident.
sorry, it's probably that would be my mistake.
No,
We've
no.
also heard them called storm cards or storm records.
I would call them a storm incident. And I'm always a wee bit wary because, excuse me, sometimes they're not quite accurate.
Right. All right. Thank
For
you.
a number of reasons, people will say things and they're typed up, so sometimes it's misunderstanding, communication, perception or whatever. So they're a good hint in terms of our direction, but I would always, I think what they say for SIOs is assume nothing, believe, I know it sounds terrible, assume nothing, believe nothing and check everything. So it's the bit about actually checking that the controller has typed in exactly what's been said. Sometimes there's errors.
Thank you. And then we've talked about the importance of a post-mortem in relation. Would that also be something that would be presumably helpful evidence if you're analysing or developing a hypothesis of this sort?
Extremely helpful evidence.
You say extremely. Why do you say that?
Oh, sorry, in terms of motivation? Maybe not extremely, sorry, I'll take that back.
But still helpful,
Yes,
possibly?
yes.
Can I ask you about the development of this hypothesis about possible race motivation discrimination? You've talked about the possibility that Mr. Boal was treated differently because he was a black man. And to what extent would the development of this hypothesis be assisted by an interim post-mortem? I mean, we know in this particular situation, we heard from the pathologist, Dr. Shearer, that the initial post-mortem was signed on the post-mortem took place on the 4th of May, and the initial post-mortem report was dated the 6th of May, and the cause of death in that initial post-mortem was unascertained, pending investigation. And she gave evidence that she had asked for investigations about possible infections and toxicology and things of that sort. I think I know what you're going to say, but would that type of post-mortem report, an initial post-mortem saying unascertained, pending investigations, permit you to draw a line under that hypotheses that we're talking about and exclude it completely?
Absolutely not.
We have heard about airwaves messages. We've had the benefit of listening to many of these airwaves messages. From those airwaves messages alone, we've heard evidence that the officers arrived at 7:20 in the morning on the 3rd of May. That in terms of timescale, within 75 seconds of their arrival, the van stopping at Hayfield Road, that Mr. Boal had been hit to the head with a baton 2 or 3 times. He'd been hit to the arms or body 2 or 3 times. Pava spray had been discharged, CS spray had been discharged, and that he'd been brought to the ground and brought into a restraint on the ground by multiple officers. The words used were several officers involved in a big restraint, that leg restraints had been used, and he may have been battened to the head. From that evidence, just purely from the airwaves messages, would that permit an investigator to rule out the hypotheses we're talking about?
That race was a factor in
Yes.
their actions. No, that would, I'd be putting that potentially supporting the suggestion. There's also a bit about you would have to know what danger Mr. Boal presented at that time, but it absolutely doesn't. You couldn't rule that race being a factor with that type of information.
I don't want to mislead. There's many airwaves messages and a lot of information in there. I'm obviously extracting certain elements to see if that would permit you to exclude that race hypotheses.
No.
We have heard evidence that statements were given by police officers to PERC on the 4th of June, so just over a month after Mr. Boal died. And again, there were many statements given, and the chair has heard a lot of detailed evidence about those statements that were given to PERC. But again, there appears to be evidence that Mr. Boal was hit over the head with a baton on a number of occasions, with his hit on the arms on a number of occasions, that there had been 6 discharges of both CS and Pava spray by officers initially at the scene, that he'd been shoulder charged to the ground and brought into restraint, that there'd been multiple officers in that restraint. Again, just taking that as a snapshot, if we can, would that permit an investigator to exclude the race hypotheses, any of that information?
No.
And we've also heard evidence of a final post-mortem report from Dr. Shearer, the pathologist, that this was completed after the investigations which she'd instructed had been carried out. And in relation to that, that was dated the 18th of June. So after the statements, if you can just give me a moment. And we've heard evidence that gave the medical cause of death, 1A, sudden death in a man intoxicated by MDMA, ecstasy and alpha PVP, whilst being restrained. I appreciate you've not got the full post-mortem report in front of you, but with a final post-mortem report with that as a cause of death, would that in itself permit an investigator to draw a line under this hypothesis and exclude it completely?
No.
Thank you. I would like to move on, if I may, to the accounts from the officers. We've touched on this to some extent. Can we look at paragraphs 122 and 123, please? We've dealt with 122 there. And 123, I would say that I wasn't sure at all exactly what the officers had done at this initial stage. We were trying to work out what the officers had done in terms of restraint, never mind why they did it. On that first day, I don't think we even got a good understanding of the police interaction with Mr. Boal in any detail, such as the use of batons or police restraint on him. Maybe others were aware, I certainly wasn't. We've heard evidence that there were notebooks weren't completed, operational statements weren't prepared by the officers. The statements to PERC weren't given till the 4th of June. And use of force forms weren't completed and use of spray forms weren't completed. In light of that, you've said on the first day, I don't think we even got a good understanding of the police interaction. Did you feel on that day that you had access to enough information from the police about what had actually happened at Hayfield Road?
No, I certainly didn't have a good understanding of the action of an officer or officers. And I suppose this is in hindsight. That I'm aware that the PIM process that was put in place, now I would have to say at the time, my understanding of the PIM process following the course I was meant to go on was for firearms officers. So in terms of how that was going to be developed for this incident, which wasn't a firearms incident, and for me was more a welfare support role as opposed to PIM. So, and this is after the incident. So now I'm reminded myself about that process and the PIM's role in terms of basic facts. I think that would have been really helpful.
And why do you say that?
Because if it's a firearms officer and the PIM's role is to get basic facts in terms of what officers were there, what was their position, and what was the manner of how they acted. And for me, we didn't have an understanding of who'd done what. So we might have known that there was restraint. And I'm only speaking for myself, and I suppose maybe Pat Campbell was, maybe other people were, but I can't recall any discussions in terms of individual officers, what their role was in that restraint. There might have been officers who didn't play a part in that restraint, or played I know this sounds terrible, but a lesser part in that restraint, or who had arrived later on during the restraint. It's a bit about, actually, it's not talking about a group of officers, it's talking about each individual officer and their individual actions, which I think in terms of basic facts, if a PIM in a firearms incident, one of his main parts is to identify the principal officer who shot the individual, then if they were applying the same PIM rules here, then the PIM would have got basic details as to the positioning of each of the officers and what part they played in that restraint process. And was there any there that didn't play a part in the process, as opposed to having them all in the same room and the advice being saying nothing? Is that?
Yes, that's helpful. We've heard some evidence that some witnesses have said there was simply no evidence that this was racially motivated. And there was nothing from the outset to suggest that the actions of the officers were because Mr. Boal was black. Do you have any comment about that approach? Simply saying that we didn't have any evidence that was the...
So I go back to the 3 stages of an investigation.
Yeah.
So the initial stage, you are identifying, seizing, controlling, taking possession of potential evidence or information. So I can't see anything that was done in that first 24 hours that somebody could say, well, there was no evidence to suggest that race was a factor, because hardly anything that they were doing was relating to the officer's motivation and whether Mr. Boal's ethnicity had anything to do with it.
Thank you. Would it surprise you to know that this wasn't one of the hypotheses that was being investigated?
On what day?
On the 3rd of May, on the 4th of May, 2015.
So in terms of, on the 3rd of May, in terms of that hypothesis, those initial actions, the hypothesis wouldn't have much bearing on those initial actions or fast-track actions. I would say by the following day, the 4th of May, when the fast-track actions are complete, that's when you start developing your hypotheses and your inquiries around hypotheses.
So you would have expected that this was a hypothesis that would have developed as time moved on from the 3rd of May?
Yes.
I'm conscious of the time. Would that perhaps be...
So can you come back tomorrow and continue with your evidence, please, Miss Boal? So the adjourn till 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Sorry.